Hi everyone. Right. Today we're going to talk about speaking in tongues. And here we want to point out two things first. Yeah, that number one, the tongues in Mark, Acts, and First Corinthians, they're fundamentally not the same. Yeah, and there are two reasons for this. One is that in Acts, the tongues were spoken spontaneously, right, as the Spirit came upon them and gave them utterance. Whereas in First Corinthians, the tongues were spoken at will. Yeah. And in Acts, everyone present understood whatever was spoken, and there was no need for interpretation. Whereas in Corinthians, in First Corinthians, the tongues had to be interpreted to be understood. Yeah. So therein lies the fundamental difference between tongues described in Acts as well as tongues described in First Corinthians. So is there a need for us to make such a note of the fundamental difference? Well, we'll see. Yeah. Now, first of all, we'll go and look at Mark 16. And in Mark 16, actually, Jesus spoke about tongues. And these tongues, according to the passage here, are a sign of the authenticity of the preacher as well as the message which is being preached. Yeah. So Jesus gave a heads up to the apostles, to the disciples, whom he asked to go and preach the word. And he tells them, right, gives them a head start that when they go about preaching the word, their authenticity and the authenticity of their message will be confirmed by many signs. Yeah, and amongst the many signs will be this sign of tongues. Yeah. So the sign of tongues, among many tongues, is actually used to confirm the apostles' preaching. Now, and that actually happens in the Acts chapter 2 and later in other passages as well. In Acts chapter 2, we are all familiar, right? That at the place that they were gathered, where the believers and the apostles are, right? The Holy Spirit came upon them, and then they began to speak in tongues as the Spirit gave utterance. Yeah, and when the Spirit gave utterance, the audience were able to understand what was being spoken, right? In this case, they understood it because they hear it in their own language. Just like here, also, they pointed out that each of us in his own native language. Same here, we heard them telling in our own language the mighty words of God. Yeah. So here in the in Acts chapter 2, a few things to point out. One thing is that the speakers were the one who spoke in tongues. Yeah. And whatever they spoke in, or whatever they spoke, right, whatever was spoken was understood by the audience. And again, we emphasize that they didn't speak at will. It was the Spirit that gave them utterance, and no interpretation was required. Right. Now, in the Acts chapter 10, Peter also, while still preaching, right, the Holy Spirit fell on all who heard the word. Here he was talking to the Gentiles, right? And the Gentiles heard them, and then they begin speaking in tongues and extolling God, praising God. Yeah. So here the difference is that instead of Peter being the speaker speaking in tongues, it was the hearers, the audience that spoke in tongues, right? And by the hearers speaking in tongues, again, it was a sign to authenticate Peter and also to authenticate the message that he was preaching. And these were all possible because it was enabled by the Holy Spirit, without the audience themselves wanting to speak in tongues. So the audience spoke in tongues spontaneously as the Holy Spirit gave utterance. So again, that's the fact we want to emphasize. And same thing happens here in Acts chapter 19, this time involving Paul, right? And when Paul laid his hands on them, the Holy Spirit came on them and they began speaking in tongues and prophesying. So again, another incident to show what we have been talking about so far, right? So the conclusion here, interim conclusion, Jesus mentioned the sign of tongues, right? The apostles' preaching were accompanied and confirmed by the sign of tongues, amongst others, right? And then there were sometimes speakers, sometimes hearers of the word that actually spoke in tongues spontaneously. When the Holy Spirit gave them utterance, everyone present understood what was spoken and no need for interpretation. Now, going forward to 1 Corinthians. Now, 1 Corinthians talk about tongues as spiritual gifts from the Holy Spirit. Yeah, meaning to say, as most people have a consensus on, that people are given the spiritual gift to speak in a language which they did not learn. Yeah, most typical example given would be like if you are going to preach to an audience that speak a different language from you, right? Then the Holy Spirit will enable you to speak in their language, right? So that they can understand you. But at the same time also, there will be situations whereby you speak certain languages in a certain language, which is not understood by the audience. Then there will be others who have the gift of interpretation of tongues to interpret for you whatever you are speaking for the audience. Yeah. Right. So whichever is the case, right? The tongues that is being spoken would be intelligible, meaning that it would be language which is which is known. It's a known language. It's not an unknown language or some kind of a mysterious language. Further down, here Paul mentioned about speaking in tongues, in the sense that it is between a person and God. Yeah, very close, intimate conversation between a person and a God, whereby the person utters mysteries in the spirit, right? So tongues here can mean uttering mysteries in the Holy Spirit between you and God privately, meaning to say that in a situation where somebody is praying, right? Yeah, the person may so-called utter mysteries, right? In the process of communing with God. And this kind of situation is often compared to another passage in Romans 8:26-27, where it says that, likewise, the Spirit help us in our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. Yeah. So this situation and the situation here in Corinthians seems to be very similar, right? Whereby a person in very deep, intense prayer, right? Sometimes so-called runs out of words, and then the Holy Spirit intercedes, intercedes. Yeah, with groanings or with mysteries. Yeah, so the person begin to utter mysteries in the Holy Spirit, in the Spirit, and or the Spirit begins to intercede for the person with groanings. Now, in whichever is the case, it involves, in this case, it involves the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit's what do you call help, with the Holy Spirit's help. It is the Holy Spirit that gives utterance also in that sense. Yeah. So this is again possible when we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 14 here, verse 2. and comparing it to Romans 8. Yeah, that tongues can actually mean this. Okay. Now, what about other situations? Now, Paul describes other situations whereby he finds people uttering meaningless, indistinct sounds, unintelligibly. In other words, it's not a natural language that people can understand. Yeah, they are just sounds indistinct, meaningless. And he described these people as speaking into the air. In fact, sounds like he's reprimanding people who does this. So it says that if a bugle gives an indistinct sound, who will get ready for battle? So with yourself, if with your tongue you utter speech that is not intelligible, right? And how will anyone know what is said, right? Or you will be speaking to the air. Yeah. So there are people who are doing this, even in those days. Yeah. Then Paul talks about in the church, what should we do then? Since there are so many kinds of so-called tongues, yeah, what should we do in a church then? Well, in a church setting, yeah, Paul concluded that it would be better for tongues to be intelligible. In other words, whatever you want to speak, it should best be in the natural language that people can understand. Yeah, and not be intelligible, right? Indistinct sounds, speaking to the air, meaningless words, and so on. Nor be mysteries in the Holy Spirit. Not that mysteries in the Holy Spirit are anything wrong, right? We said earlier that it's okay. It's communion between you and God. But what Paul here is saying that in the church, in the public setting, yeah, let your mysteries in the Holy Spirit be private. Yeah, between communion, it's communion between you and God. So let it be private, right? Yeah. So if you're in the church, this is what you should be doing. Yeah. Now here also, it talks about people who would like to exercise their spiritual gift, right? Who would like to speak in a tongue, right? It says that let there be only 2 or 3. In other words, you can actually pre-plan it, right? You can do it at will. You can pre-plan it, right? And you could and might also want to pre-plan for people to interpret. Yeah, right. So again, the tongues that are spoken of here, yeah, they are definitely not the tongues that we earlier saw in Acts. Yeah, whereby it is not at will, it is not pre-planned, right? It doesn't need to be interpreted and so on. Yeah. So do we so-called allow speaking in tongues such as this? Yeah. Okay, I think it is okay so long as they are intelligible, right? And they have and they are interpreted, they are interpreted and are done orderly. Not too many people doing that. Yeah, because apparently in the Church of Corinth, yeah, there may be people speaking a lot of languages. Yeah, people coming from all over the place, so might be difficult to have too many people speaking different languages and then having to be interpreted. So the whole service, so-called, the whole service will be kind of like uh, very chaotic, right? Yeah. So let's do a quick summary again here of what we can learn from speaking in tongues in First Corinthians, right? So we learned that the tongues can be can mean uttering mysteries in the Holy Spirit between you and God privately, right? The tongues can be spiritual gifts, right? Spoken intelligibly and interpreted at will publicly. However, there are also people who utter meaningless, indistinct sounds, right? And speaking into the air, right? So, does this constitute tongues, right? As as in speaking in tongues, right? So let's put the two side by side, yeah? Yeah, tongues in Mark, Acts, and tongues in Corinthians, right? These are the points that we have made so far. Of course, the important question we want to ask at the end of this discussion is where do people, right? Where do people speaking in tongues today fit in? Yeah. Well, even though the tongues movement has by and large so-called died down, not much of emphasis today, there are still many pastors, preachers who so-called speak in tongues. So what are they actually doing? What kind of tongues are they actually speaking, right? Are they signs of, are they speaking tongues as in the kind of sign of tongue that Jesus mentioned, right? Are they uttering mysteries in the Holy Spirit, right? Are they exercising their spiritual gift, or are they simply speaking to the air? Yeah. Well, I think the conclusion we like to draw here is that they are just speaking into the air, into the air. So they are uttering meaningless, indistinct sounds unintelligibly because no one understands what they are talking, right? So they are neither signs of tongues, right, as happened in Acts, where it is spontaneous, right? Whether it's spoken by the speakers or spoken by the hearers, right? Everybody understood. So those are the sign of tongues that Jesus talked about, and those are the sign of tongues which we see in the book of Acts. Yeah. Neither are they mysteries of the Holy Spirit, because mystery of the Holy Spirit means that it is a private conversation between you and God. Yeah. But then people who are speaking in tongues in public now, making indistinct sounds unintelligibly, speaking to the air, they are hardly, they can hardly be said to be communing with God privately, right? Privately. So they are definitely not the mysteries of the Holy Spirit that we earlier explained. And neither are they exercising spiritual gift, because our understanding of spiritual gift is that they would be speaking something intelligible and can be understood, right, by people, by the hearers. And if they are not if cannot be understood, then there will be people who will interpret it. Yeah, but first of all, it must be intelligible. Intelligible. So that's our understanding of spiritual gifts. So it might not be very wrong to say that these people speaking in tongues are mistaken on two counts. Firstly, they mistakenly want to authenticate their preaching by the sign of tongues. By speaking in tongues themselves or asking the audience to do so at will. Yeah, because the sign of tongues is supposed to be given by the Holy Spirit. When the Holy Spirit gives utterance, yeah, then the audience understanding whatever was spoken automatically. Yeah. But here, instead of Holy Spirit give utterance, yeah, the preachers speak in tongues themselves. So instead of the Holy Spirit giving utterance to the speaker or to the audience, yeah, it is the speaker and the audience who are speaking in tongues, so-called at will, making meaningless, indistinct sounds unintelligibly. Yeah. And some of these people speaking in tongues would argue that they are actually uttering mysteries in the Holy Spirit. They actually communing between themselves and God. But it is not very convincing, because uttering mysteries in Holy Spirit between you and God should have been done privately, and not by shouting at the top of your voice, screaming at the top of your voice in public. Meaningless, indistinct sounds, right? Which are unintelligible. I think it would be very hard to convince anyone that these are actually uttering mysteries in the Holy Spirit between you and God. And certainly they are not exhibiting tongues as spiritual gifts. Since they are neither speaking intelligibly, right, nor being interpreted, right? So that's the conclusion we arrive at on the topic of speaking in tongues. I hope it has been clear, right? And if you find this explanation clear and helpful, might be you want to share this slides and share this information with whoever might benefit from it, right? Okay, so that's the end of the session. Okay, I look forward to speaking to you again on another topic soon. Thank you very much.